Welcome to Applied Animal Nutrition. Today's task is we're going to learn about how to create a feed mix and calculate the nutritive value of that mix so that we can use it to build rations in the future. And so we're going to focus on this idea of, let me get to the pen, of a mix. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take 3 to 4 ingredients and blend them together and create essentially a new feed. And so that way we can use this new feed to solve for rations. And it's a way to utilize multiple ingredients and still be able to solve simple rations. And so just to give an example of something like this, there's a lot of times you go to a feed store and there's sweet feeds. Generally they're a blend of corn, oats, barley, and some molasses. They may have other additives and nutrients in there to help the animal's digestion or health and well-being. And so those are mixed feeds and multiple ingredients, but we can feed them as one feed. And that's kind of what we're going over today, because you may be in a situation that you're going to create a supplement mix for some ewes that are going into late gestation and early lactation, and you may have 2 or 3 ingredients that you want to mix together and make sure that they're getting the right amount of protein or calories. So that's what we're going to look at today. And so the first step is to identify your feeds and look up all the data and get the data. And I've mentioned before that I'm a big fan of the Noble Feed Library out of Ardmore, Oklahoma. It's an online feed library. Super handy to look up a lot of different feeds and be able to get the chemical composition of each feed. For today's example, we're going to be working with cracked corn, oat grain, barley grain. So we're making a basic cob mix, corn, oats, and barley, and some molasses. And I went through and I looked up the dry matter, the crude protein, the TDN, total digestible nutrients, and the mCals of net energy for gain. Because when I'm building rations, these are the big common ones. The nutritional parameters could be whatever you're making a mix for. Say if you're trying to make a calcium mix to boost eggshell production in hens, whatever the case may be. But this is just an example of what we're going to be working with. And our mix today, on an as-fed basis, we're going to assume that it's 50% corn. I gotta check my numbers here. 15% oat grain, 25% barley, and 10% molasses. So this is just getting our information collected. And whenever we're doing any kind of ration formulation for our animals, one of the major aspects is knowing what feeds we have available and the chemical composition of those feeds. This type of problem is not any different. So if I look up the dry matter percentage for all of these feeds, and I'm going to fill out this table, I'll put in the dry matter protein as a percent of dry matter, TDN as a percent of dry matter, and the megacalories of net energy for gain per pound of dry matter. So let me go ahead and fill in this table. And so what we're wanting to do is for each parameter, meaning dry matter, or ER, dry matter, protein, TDN, and net energy for gain, we're basically going to be calculating the contribution from each ingredient. And this is going to allow us to calculate kind of a weighted average for our values, because we know our mix is going to be half corn. And so we need to weight the amount of protein that's coming just from corn. We need to get the amount of protein coming from the oats and the barley, and they all have different amounts. And so that is our goal, is to get a general weighted average of each of these nutrient parameters for our feed mix. And we're going to refer back to this as we go. So now we're going to go into our next step. And I'm going to go ahead and move this up a little bit. And I will share the whiteboard for those that would like it. Oops, didn't want to move that. Okay. So our second step that we're going to be working with is, what basis are we in? Are we in a dry matter basis or as fed, meaning how we present it to the animal? And so when we're looking at this problem, you'll notice that I gave the initial proportions of the mix on an as fed basis. But if we're going to be figuring out the amount of nutrients, that is always going to be on a dry matter basis here. These values are all dry matter. So what we're going to need to do is get to where everything's on the same playing field, so to speak. Because remember, we can't compare apples to oranges. We can't do, we've got to get to a dry matter amount before we can figure out how much protein, TDN, or net energy we have there. And there's a couple different ways you could approach this problem. I'm going to show you how I always think about it and see what that does and see how that works for you. So now we know that we are starting in as fed, but we're going to need dry matter nutrient concentration. So I'm going to use the symbol for concentration. So that just helps me to clarify in my mind what we're going to be doing. And then next step is how much of each parameter or nutrient is coming from each ingredient. So that's our big question, is how much dry matter is coming from corn, oats, barley, how much protein is coming from each of those. And that's what we're going to be working on. Now there's a couple equations that will help us. And so anytime we have an amount of a feed, and so we're talking about pounds, and in my era, hashtag means pounds. And so if we take that amount times the dry matter percentage, and this is just a reminder, this will be on the decimal form, that's going to give us the pounds of dry matter. So that's going to be our first step, and we're always going to use this amount times the parameter concentration. And so then we could take this amount of dry matter, the pounds of dry matter, times the nutrient concentration, whether it's protein, TDN, whatever the case may be. And that's going to give us the pounds of nutrient coming from that feed. So that's what we're going to be working on doing today. Now, one of the biggest tips I can give anybody that's just learning how to formulate rations is to keep organized. I use tables because that really helps me to keep my data structured in a way that I know exactly what numbers I'm working with and what I've got ahead of me. So to show you how to do this, we're going to work through the example that I gave earlier. And just as a quick, whoops, I don't want to move that. As a quick review, we're going to be building a corn, oats, barley, and molasses mix that is 50% corn, 15% oats, 25% barley, and 10% molasses on an as-fed basis. And we have collected all of this data from whether it's a textbook or the Noble Feed Library, or a lot of cooperative extension websites have feed value tables available. Any of those, wherever your source of data comes from. And so we've talked about understanding that we're starting in as-fed, but we've got to get to dry matter. And we are going to be figuring out how much nutrient is coming from each ingredient. So let's go ahead and start organizing. The first parameter is I want to know how much dry matter and what the dry matter percentage of this mix is going to be. So when I say keep organized and use a table, I start off with making a table that's going to have my ingredients. So in this case, we're going to have corn, oats, barley, and molasses. I will abbreviate just because it saves some time. And we're starting off knowing that we know how many pounds as fed we have. We know that out of a total of 100 pounds, kind of equating a percentage to 100 pounds, we would have 50 pounds coming from corn, 15 pounds coming from oats, 25 pounds coming from barley, and 10 pounds coming from molasses. So that our total is 100. And this was all information that was given to us in a problem. I say a nutritionist formulated a mix and said, this is what your mix is going to be. And you wanted to know what protein's in there and those types of things. This is how you would figure it out. So we know the formulas that I mentioned before was taking an amount, in this case the amount as fed, and we're going to multiply each one times that ingredient's respective dry matter percent. So corn was 88% dry matter. The oats was 89% dry matter. So was the barley. They happen to be the same. And the molasses was 77. So we're going to figure out how many pounds of dry matter we have in each ingredient. So if I do the math on my calculator and take 50 times 0.88, I get 44.00 pounds of dry matter coming from 50 pounds of corn. So if we think about this, it makes sense that our number is slightly smaller because we're removing the water and getting to just the dry portion of the feed, so it should have a lighter weight. So my 44 makes sense. We do the rest of these, and we should come up with the following answers. So from each ingredient, from corn we got 44 pounds of dry matter, oats 13.35, from barley 22.25, and 7.7 pounds from molasses. If we add all of these up, I came up with 87.30 pounds of dry matter in 100 pounds of feed. And so if we were to draw an example, like just to kind of do a visual representation, if this is that 100 pounds of as-fed, of that mix, then we would know that 87% of it is dry matter. And the remaining percent would be water. And so that just kind of helps us visualize what our nutrients are truly in. So to calculate a percentage, we would simply take the part, in this case, the 87.3, divided by the whole, or 100 pounds, times 100. This one's fairly straightforward. Our mix is 87.30% dry matter. So we were doing a weighted average. And that means that we were figuring out the nutrient composition. In this case, we were just looking at dry matter coming from each ingredient, add them up, and calculate it as a proportion or percentage of the total amount. So that was how we did the dry matter. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit, and let's work on the crude protein percent next. And that's going to be as a percent of dry matter. So now we're going to take our same list of ingredients, corn, oats, barley, and molasses, and now we want our protein on a percent dry matter basis. So now we're going to take this information and start with it. How many pounds of dry matter do we have? So instead of starting it as fed, now we're able to use our percentages on a dry basis. And we're going to bring those values over. And we know that we're working out of 87.30. Okay, so now we kind of have a start point, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to multiply, and in this case, times the crude protein percent, so that we can figure out how many pounds of protein is coming from each feed. So corn is 10% protein, oats is 13, 12% for the barley, and 9%. And you have to remember, you have to move the decimal twice. So you have to put a leading zero in front of that, or a zero in front of that 9. And that's going to tell us how many pounds of protein is coming from each ingredient. So I'm going to go through and run this through the calculator and put in those values. All right, so we found that we've got a little over 4 pounds of protein coming from corn, about 1.75 pounds coming from oats, 2.67 from barley, and 0.69 coming from molasses. Again, we're going to add these values up, and I get 9.50 pounds of crude protein in 87 pounds of dry matter. So to figure out that percent protein, we're going to take the part, in this case, the pounds of protein, out of the whole, the pounds of dry matter. And take that value times 100, and what we get is 10.88% crude protein on a dry matter basis. So that's all we're doing over and over again for each nutrient parameter. And now we're going to be starting each time with that pounds of dry matter because we want our nutrient expression to be on a dry matter basis. So the next step would be to do the TDN calculation. So if we're going to do TDN as a percentage of dry matter, again we got corn, oats, barley, and molasses. I'm getting shorthand here. We have 44.00 pounds of dry matter, and this is why I do tables, because I kind of keep them under the general headings. And I've now been doing this for a lot of years, and I know that every time I write one of these tables, what's in every column. And it just helps keep me organized. And so this is the pounds of dry matter. But now we're doing TDN, so we're going to use the TDN percentages. So corn was 90%, oats were 76%, and remember we're putting all this on a decimal form, 84% for the barley, and it should be 75, yep. 75% for the molasses. So now we're going to get the pounds of TDN. And if I solve those, we've got about 39.6 pounds of TDN coming from corn, 10.15 pounds of TDN coming from oats, 18.69 coming from the barley, and 5.78 coming from molasses. Add them up, and that is 74.22 pounds of TDN out of 87.3 pounds of dry matter. So now we can calculate the percentage just like we did the protein by putting the part, in this case 74.22, over the whole 87.3 times 100 to give us 85.02% TDN on a dry matter basis. So not too bad, and we're getting a good average. And one thing that I always do as a mental check is take a look at my answer, in this case the 85.02, and does it make sense to be somewhere between our range of numbers of 0.9 and 0.75. So it's not outside this range, because mathematically that would be impossible. And it makes sense that it's falling kind of in the upper end of that because there's a lot of corn in there. So it should be up closer to that than a couple of the other ingredients. The same for protein. It makes sense that it's somewhere between 9 and 13% and probably closer to that 10 mark just because we have so much corn in the diet. So these values are making sense, logical, and representing the mix that we are working with. Last one we're going to do is show you how to do this for calories. And so we're going to do net energy for gain. And what we're going to be figuring out is mcals per pound of dry matter. And so we're still going to be working with corn, oats, barley, and molasses. And we're going to start with the pounds of dry matter that we've been doing. And we know that we're working with 87.3 pounds of dry matter. So now we're going to multiply times the nutrient concentration. And this time it's not a percentage per se. It is megacalories per pound. And when you look up the net energy values in Noble, if you're using the Noble website, it actually reports it in megacalories per pound, but it's actually, the values are megacalorie per hundredweight. You still have to move the decimal on them. But so I've already looked them up and converted them to megacalories per pound, and we're simply going to multiply. And so corn was 0.7 megacalories per pound of dry matter. Oats was 0.52. Barley is 0.61, and molasses is 0.50. So now if we figure out how many mcals are coming from each ingredient, I multiply 44 times 0.7 to get 30.8. 13.35 times 0.52 is 6.94. 22.25. 13.57, and finally 3.85. So if we add these up, we have 55.16 mcals in 87.3 pounds of dry matter. So now remember, calories are going to be per pound. They're not a percentage. And so instead of setting this up like a percentage, like with the times 100, we're simply going to take the 55.16, the megacalories, divided by the pounds of dry matter. And that gives us 0.63 mcals of NEG per pound of dry matter. If we were to convert that to hundredweight, we'd just times 100, and that would be 63 mcals. And so again, doing my quick check, it makes sense that we've got 70 between our 0.63 is between 0.5 and 0.7 and closer to the 0.7 because of the amount of corn. So that's a quick way, and it's just calculating a weighted average of being able to figure out when you have a mix of feeds but you don't know what the nutrient composition is. You can look up the individual feeds and calculate the value for your mix as well. Thank you.